There is a $75 billion global agricultural industry that has spent the past 50 years quietly engineering a single outcome, and that outcome is making you believe, deep in your subconscious, that growing your own food is something that happens exclusively in rural areas on Tuodi that you do not own and cannot access. Because if the average apartment dweller in New York or Tokyo or London ever stumbled upon the simple truth that their 400 square feet of living space contains more food-producing potential than a traditional half-acre garden, the cascading collapse of the industrial food supply chain would begin with a single viral video and end with millions of people reclaiming the most fundamental human capability that civilization has systematically stripped away over the past 3 generations. And this is not hyperbole, but rather simple mathematics when you understand that lettuce shipped from California to New York travels 3,000 miles and loses 30% of its nutrients before ever reaching a grocery store shelf. While the same lettuce can go from seed to salad bowl in your bedroom closet in 28 days with zero transportation, zero packaging, and nutrients that are actually intact enough to support human health. Yet you have never seen this information marketed, featured, or even mentioned by the major gardening publications, home improvement networks, or agricultural extension programs that shape what ordinary people believe is possible within their circumstances. Because the billion-dollar corporate interests that control seed distribution, fertilizer manufacturing, and supermarket supply chains have a very specific interest in maintaining the illusion that food production is impossibly complex, legally restricted, and practically achievable only by those with land, equipment, and professional expertise, when the archaeological record shows that humans were successfully cultivating food in what we would today call apartments, and urban environments 4,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, in ancient Rome, in dense vertical cities throughout China, and in virtually every civilization that learned to prioritize efficient food production, over the romantic ideal of sprawling rural farmland that was itself a relatively recent invention born of industrial age convenience rather than agricultural necessity. The breaking point came in 1987 when a quietly rebellious horticulturist named Maria Santos, working at a small agricultural research station in São Paulo, Brazil, noticed something that would eventually get her quietly reassigned to a desk job and her research files, classified as not for publication. Because what Maria discovered during her experiments with urban food production was that plants grown in completely artificial environments without any natural soil whatsoever did not simply match the growth rates of traditional garden plants, but rather outperformed them by factors that defied everything in the academic literature. And when she traced the scientific mechanism behind this anomaly, she found that traditional gardening advice had the entire concept of plant nutrition fundamentally backwards. Because for over a century we had been taught that plants extract nutrients from soil through roots, as if soil were a kind of food container, when in reality soil is actually a hostile environment that plants tolerate rather than thrive in, a medium that competes with root systems for oxygen, harbors pathogens and parasites, locks nutrients into unavailable chemical forms, and requires constant intervention to maintain, whereas what plants actually need is nothing more complicated than dissolved minerals, clean water, and oxygen at the root zone in precise concentrations that fluctuate dynamically based on the plant's growth stage. And Maria's insight was not that traditional soil gardening was wrong per se, but rather that soil was never the point. Soil was always just a delivery mechanism that happened to be good enough for centuries of pre-industrial agriculture, but was wildly inefficient compared to what becomes possible when you eliminate the middleman and deliver exactly what plants need directly to their roots in forms they can absorb instantly without waiting for soil microbes to break down organic matter into bioavailable compounds. Here is the core scientific principle that will change the way you think about plants forever. And I want you to read this sentence carefully because it contains everything you need to understand to grow food successfully in any space. Plants do not eat soil. Plants drink their food in the form of dissolved mineral ions that their root cells absorb through a process called passive transport. When those ions are present in the water surrounding the roots at concentrations higher than inside the plant cells themselves, which means that as long as you maintain the right concentration of dissolved minerals in water that is in direct contact with roots that have access to oxygen, the elaborate fiction of soil composition, pH balancing, composting schedules, and seasonal amendments becomes completely unnecessary because you have skipped ahead to the final destination that traditional gardening takes years to reach through trial and error. And this is why the most productive food gardens in the world today are not found in rural farmland but in basement facilities, warehouse spaces, and high-rise apartment buildings where growers have abandoned the old ways entirely in favor of what the industry now calls controlled environment agriculture, a fancy term for doing what Maria Santos discovered should have been obvious all along, which is giving plants exactly what they need and nothing that they do not in a system so elegant in its simplicity that a 12-year-old can master it within an afternoon. Once the fundamental misunderstanding about soil being essential is cleared away like fog before morning sun. Now let me walk you through building a complete apartment farming system with components that you can acquire for under $70 from sources that are not trying to convince you that you need anything complicated, elaborate, or expensive. Starting with what is called a deep water culture setup, which sounds technical, but is actually just a fancy way of describing roots dangling in water that is full of air, because root cells need oxygen just like all your other cells. And the revelation that kills most people's attempts at indoor gardening is that roots, submerged in stagnant water, drown and rot within days, while roots in highly oxygenated water thrive and develop dense root masses that look almost unnatural in their health and vigor. And the way you oxygenate water is with a simple aquarium air pump and an air stone, $20 at any pet store, connected by clear vinyl tubing that carries air bubbles down into your nutrient reservoir, where they rise continuously and create the churning oxygen-rich environment that roots crave. And your container can be as simple as an opaque plastic storage tub from the dollar store, 12 inches wide, 8 inches deep, and 24 inches long, which will comfortably support 6 to 8 lettuce plants or 4 compact vegetables like bush tomatoes or peppers. And this is where most people make their first mistake by spending hundreds of dollars on specialized hydroponic kits when the most effective systems are built from materials that cost as much as a few meals at a restaurant and perform better than anything that has been marketed to consumers as beginner-friendly, because those commercial products are designed by companies whose interests are in selling you upgrades rather than in helping you succeed independently. The nutrient solution is what separates the beginners who abandon hydroponics after disappointing first attempts from the apartment farmers who eventually produce more food than they can eat. And the secret that the specialty nutrient companies do not want you to understand is that plants need 16 essential mineral elements that can all be purchased individually for a few dollars each or obtained through a simple 3-part solution that costs about $15 and lasts for months of growing, because the industrial gardening complex has convinced consumers that they need specialty formulations for every specific plant, when the reality is that all edible plants use the same 16 minerals in roughly the same proportions, with the primary difference being that fast-growing leafy greens like lettuce and spinach need higher nitrogen concentrations, while fruiting plants like tomatoes and peppers need slightly more phosphorus and potassium as they transition from vegetative growth to flowering. And the technique that most people never discover because it is not profitable to mention is that you can create perfectly adequate nutrients for apartment farming by dissolving 1 teaspoon of agricultural lime per gallon of water to provide calcium and raise pH, 1 teaspoon of Epsom salt per gallon for magnesium, and a small handful of general-purpose water-soluble fertilizer following package directions for the remaining micronutrients, with the entire solution costing pennies per gallon compared to the $20 bottles of specialty hydroponic nutrients that perform no better for apartment scale production. And the pH level that you want to target is between 5.8 and 6.2. which you can verify with a simple testing kit that costs about $8 and is essential because even perfect nutrient concentrations are useless if pH is too high or too low for roots to absorb them, creating a scenario where you technically have everything your plants need, but they starve anyway in a cruel irony that makes people give up on indoor growing thinking they lack some mysterious skill when in fact they simply never measured their water chemistry. And here's the part most people miss when they set up their first system: the detail that transforms mediocre results into explosive exponential growth. The temperature of your nutrient solution matters as much as any other factor, because root metabolism slows dramatically when water is below 60 degrees Fahrenheit and accelerates past optimal levels when water rises above 75 degrees, with the sweet spot for virtually all edible plants being between 68 and 72 degrees. And this explains why basement growers often struggle with slow growth in winter, even when lights are providing adequate warmth, because the air temperature that feels comfortable to humans is irrelevant when the water sitting in cool containers never warms up enough for roots to function efficiently. And the solution is so simple that most people overlook it entirely, which is simply placing your growing container on top of a fish tank heater, the same type used for tropical aquariums, set to maintain water temperature in the desired range. Because fish tank heaters are automatic, adjustable, safe for continuous operation, and consume so little electricity that the monthly cost is indistinguishable from zero. And this single intervention often doubles or triples plant growth rates in cool indoor environments where growers assumed their slow progress was some inherent limitation of indoor gardening rather than a simply solvable temperature problem that was hiding in plain sight the entire time. The lighting equation that determines whether your apartment farm succeeds or fails, the system that combines all of these principles into a productive year-round food factory, requires surprisingly little ongoing maintenance once you understand that your role is not to nurture plants but rather to maintain conditions. Because a plant in the right conditions grows itself without any assistance beyond basic nutrient and water management. And the weekly routine that will keep your apartment farm producing indefinitely consists of spending about 15 minutes checking that your air pump is running, your water level has not dropped too low, and your light timer is functioning on schedule. With a full nutrient solution change every 3 weeks to prevent salt buildup and an inexpensive pH and EC test performed monthly to verify that your water chemistry remains in the optimal range. And within this simple routine, you can expect your first harvest of baby lettuce greens within 21 to 28 days from seeding, fresh herbs like basil and cilantro in under 40 days, and compact fruiting vegetables like tiny tin tomatoes or mini bell peppers, beginning to ripen within 70 to 90 days, with the production continuing for months thereafter as long as you maintain the basic conditions and harvest progressively rather than ripping plants out and starting over. Because most edible plants will continue producing new growth if you simply take leaves and fruit without destroying the plant, with lettuce regenerating from the center, herbs branching more profusely after cutting, and indeterminate tomatoes ripening fruit continuously until the plant exhausts itself. Now this is where the paradigm shift happens that most people never make, because every piece of gardening advice they have ever received has conditioned them to think in terms of problems and solutions, when the reality is that healthy plants do not get pests, do not get diseases, and do not need any intervention whatsoever. And this means that the goal of gardening is not to kill the aphids or cure the fungus or amend the depleted soil, but rather to create such optimal conditions that your plants simply outgrow every problem before problems become visible, because a plant that has exactly what it needs in the exact right proportions devotes its energy to productive growth rather than survival defenses, and a plant that is not stressed by nutrient deficiencies, oxygen deprivation, inappropriate pH, or inadequate light has no reason to attract the pests and diseases that target weak hosts, making the entire paradigm of pest control and disease management completely unnecessary in a properly designed system where you never encounter problems because you have eliminated the conditions that allow problems to develop. And this reframing is crucial because it shifts your focus from reactive intervention to proactive condition maintenance, a fundamentally different relationship with your plants that feels more like collaboration than struggle, and produces consistently better results with far less stress. The laughably simple technique that will save you more frustration than any other single piece of advice I can offer is this. Start your seeds not in expensive seed starting mix or complicated germination stations, but simply in wet paper towels folded inside a plastic bag on top of your refrigerator, where the consistent warmth accelerates germination dramatically while eliminating the overwatering and poor drainage that kill more seedlings than any other cause, because seeds contain everything a seedling needs for its first few days of life and simply need consistent moisture and warmth to begin the germination process, with roots emerging within 2 to 3 days for most vegetables and the tiny seedlings being transferable to your deep water culture system as soon as the first true leaves appear, completely bypassing the fragile stage where most apartment growers fail by trying to maintain soil moisture in containers that either dry out too quickly or stay too wet and develop fungus gnats. And this single technique alone can improve your success rate from the typical beginner failure rate of roughly 70% to over 90% by eliminating the most vulnerable period of plant development from the complicated equation entirely. The deeper truth that emerges from sustained practice of apartment farming is that the industrial food system has succeeded in making us feel like food production is impossibly complex and requires professional training, expensive equipment, and ideal conditions that most people do not have, when in reality every human civilization throughout history has produced food in concentrated urban environments using techniques that were never secret but have simply been forgotten or suppressed as inconvenient truths that undermine the narrative of centralized food distribution. And the skills required to grow abundant food in a small apartment are no greater than those required to maintain a potted houseplant, with the actual difference being one of confidence and understanding rather than capability, because once you internalize that plants want to grow and only need a few basic conditions to do so spectacularly well, the artificial barriers that once seemed insurmountable dissolve into simple parameters that you can measure, monitor, and adjust without specialized knowledge or expensive tools. And this transformation from dependent consumer to productive cultivator changes something fundamental in how you relate to your food, your home, and your own capability that cannot be calculated in pounds of lettuce or dollars saved, but rather shows up in the daily satisfaction of participating consciously in the ancient human story of cultivation, rather than passively consuming its industrialized aftermath. And if this feels like something you have been missing without knowing exactly what it was, then your apartment is already waiting for you to begin, a small space with unlimited potential that needs only water, light, seeds, and the understanding that everything else was always optional.